Antic frequent occurrence. Live ammunition and tear gas fired at young Mozambican men
Oh, it's just tear gas.
Tear gas, yeah.
as they take on the state that's ruled longer than they've been alive.
For years, the warning signs were there, but they were easy to ignore. Young people stopped cheering at independence rallies. Old liberation slogans began to sound hollow. The past was still celebrated, but it no longer explained the present. Then, almost without warning, Mozambique cracked open. Streets shut down. Protests spread. The country froze, not because of a coup or a foreign invasion, but because a generation quietly decided it had nothing left to lose. What followed was not random anger. It was targeted, disciplined, and deeply political. Young Mozambicans were not rejecting history. They were rejecting being governed by it. At the center of this rupture emerged a figure the system did not expect, a man who spoke less about colonialism and more about rent, jobs, and the cost of survival. His rise exposed a truth many African governments fear confronting. Liberation credentials expire when daily life collapses. Mozambique's unrest is not an isolated crisis. It is a preview. And what is unfolding there now is forcing Africa's liberation parties to confront the question they have avoided for decades. Let's get into it. The first sign was not violence. It was indifference. Independence anniversaries came and went, and something felt off. The speeches were delivered. The flags were raised. The same liberation stories were repeated word for word. But the crowd had changed. Young people stood there without emotion. No chants, no excitement, no belief. What once stirred pride now sounded like background noise. In Mozambique, this silence spread long before the streets filled with protesters. It showed up in conversations, in social media, in the way young people talked about the future, if they talked about it at all. Independence was no longer a promise. It was a date in a textbook. The ruling party spoke as if history still carried authority. But the generation listening had grown up with unemployment, rising prices, and a future that kept shrinking instead of expanding. Then, slowly, the silence hardened into refusal. Refusal to accept speeches as solutions. Refusal to accept patience as policy. Refusal to accept that the sacrifices of the past justified the stagnation of the present. Young Mozambicans were not demanding revolution. They were demanding proof that the system worked for them. What made this moment dangerous for those in power was that it didn't start with chaos. It started with clarity. Young people compared their lives to the wealth flowing out of the country, gas projects, foreign investments, export headlines, and asked a simple question: if Mozambique is growing, why are we not? The answers they received were vague, delayed, or recycled from decades ago. That gap between official optimism and lived reality widened every month. The cost of food rose, housing became unreachable, jobs required connections rather than skills, stability was advertised, but survival felt fragile. The state insisted everything was under control, yet households felt increasingly squeezed. When people stop believing official explanations, they start trusting their own experience instead. And then the streets reacted. Protests didn't erupt immediately. They spread. Roads were blocked, not out of panic, but due to coordination. Markets closed not because of fear, but choice. Mozambique did not descend into disorder. It paused. The country held its breath. That pause was more threatening than chaos because it signaled collective decision-making, not spontaneous anger. At that moment, one name began circulating with unusual speed and consistency: Venancio Mondlane. Not shouted by state media, not promoted by institutions, passed from phone to phone, rally to rally. He wasn't framed as a savior. He was framed as a voice that said what people already felt, but had never heard spoken so plainly. This was the moment Mozambique's ruling order realized something fundamental had shifted. The problem was no longer opposition parties. It was generational withdrawal. Young people were not asking to be convinced anymore. They were deciding whether the system deserved their loyalty at all. And once that decision begins forming across an entire generation, one question becomes unavoidable: who steps forward when history no longer commands obedience? That figure was Venancio Mondlane, and what made him dangerous wasn't charisma alone. It was precision. He didn't attack the government with ideology. He attacked it with specifics. While officials spoke in broad language about stability and growth, Mondlane spoke about prices in markets, the cost of rent, the absence of jobs, and the quiet panic inside households trying to survive another month. He didn't romanticize the past. In fact, he barely mentioned it. That alone separated him from the political class. Liberation history, once the centerpiece of Mozambican politics, barely featured in his message. Instead, he treated it as a settled business. Independence had been won. The real question, he argued, was what had been done with it. Mondlane's background mattered. He wasn't born into political royalty. He had worked as an engineer. He had preached as a pastor. He knew how to explain complex things simply, and how to speak morally without sounding theatrical. On social media, his messages were blunt and direct, delivered in a tone that matched how young people already spoke to each other. No ceremony, no distance, no reverence for power. His central accusation was unsettlingly simple. The country was being managed to look stable, not to actually be stable. He argued that the government was artificially holding the currency steady, hiding real inflation, and slowly draining dollars from the economy to preserve appearances. Young people didn't need to understand monetary policy to feel the consequences. They already knew money disappeared faster than before, that wages didn't stretch, that opportunities closed quietly. What made his message spread was not outrage, but recognition. Young Mozambicans didn't hear Mondlane and feel persuaded. They heard him and felt persuaded. He articulated what people already suspected but couldn't fully explain. When officials said inflation was low, lived experience said otherwise. When the state promised progress, daily life suggested stagnation. Crucially, Mondlane did not call for destruction. He didn't encourage violence. He framed the crisis as a failure of governance, not a failure of the nation. That distinction mattered. It allowed people to protest the system without rejecting the country itself. As his support grew, something shifted beneath the surface. Mondlane stopped being just an opposition figure and became a reference point. Conversations started with his arguments. Protests echoed his language. The state noticed. What had once been dismissed as noise now looked coordinated. What had seemed manageable now looked contagious. But this has happened before, in the 2024 elections. By the time the election approached, the ground had already moved. Trust was thin. Patience was gone. Expectations were sharply lowered, and scrutiny was intense. Which meant that when the votes were counted, the reaction would not depend only on numbers. It would depend on belief. And that leads directly to the moment everything snapped. What happened when the election results confirmed young people's worst fears? When the 2024 results were announced, the numbers landed like a verdict already written. The ruling party declared a comfortable victory. The margin was wide. The tone was final. For many young voters, it didn't feel like a win or a loss. It felt like exclusion. International observers spoke carefully about irregularities, but on the ground, the reaction was immediate and visceral. People didn't argue percentages. They argued legitimacy. This was the moment when suspicion hardened into certainty. Months of economic strain, ignored complaints, and widening distrust suddenly had proof. Young people concluded that voting had become symbolic rather than decisive. The ballot box, once framed as the peaceful solution, now looked like part of the problem. The response was not spontaneous chaos. It was structured resistance. Roads were blocked strategically. Transport halted. Markets shut down in sequence. Mozambique didn't erupt, it stalled. The country paused, as if waiting for an answer that never came. The state answered instead. Security forces moved in. Live ammunition was used. Arrests followed. Fear returned to streets that had briefly felt empowered. By the time the violence subsided, more than 300 people were dead. Families buried sons and daughters. Neighborhoods carried scars that could not be explained away with statements. At this point, most movements collapse. Leaders retreat. Support fragments. Survival overtakes momentum. And when Venancio Mondlane left the country amid the escalating violence, that was the expected ending. Exile usually breaks momentum. Distance usually weakens control. Silence usually follows. But this time, something strange happened. The protests didn't die. They changed shape. They became quieter, more focused, more resolved. Mondlane's absence did not erase his message. In fact, it sharpened it. His supporters didn't interpret his departure as abandonment. They interpreted it as evidence that the system had crossed from politics into punishment. This reframing mattered. The struggle stopped being about who won the vote. It became about whether dissent itself was allowed. Young people stopped asking if the election was fair and started asking if fairness was even possible within the existing order. Meanwhile, the government's narrative hardened. Order had been restored. Stability had returned. The country was moving on. But beneath that surface, something irreversible had happened. Trust had snapped. And trust, once broken, doesn't return quietly. Months passed. Tension lingered. And then came the moment no one in power had prepared for. Mondlane announced his return. Not secretly, not cautiously, publicly. The streets responded instantly. Crowds gathered. Celebrations broke out. What was supposed to be a defeated figure reappeared as a symbol of unfinished business. Fear no longer dictated behavior. Defiance did. That return forced a new question onto the table, one far more dangerous than protests. What happens when an opposition leader refuses exile and refuses violence at the same time? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When Venancio Mondlane returned, many expected an escalation. More protests, more shutdowns, maybe even a call for force. That expectation was exactly what the system was prepared for. What it was not prepared for was restraint. Instead of fueling unrest, Mondlane changed the battlefield. He announced the creation of a new political party. No street commands, no revolutionary language, no threats. Just paperwork, registration, and a clear declaration. Change would be pursued through elections, not chaos. This single decision altered everything. Until then, the state had framed the crisis as disorder. Protests could be blamed on agitators. Violence could be justified as security. But a legally registered party destroyed that framing. It forced the confrontation back into politics, where repression is harder to defend and excuses wear thin. For young supporters, this mattered more than rhetoric. Many had already risked their lives protesting. What they wanted now was direction. Mondlane offered structure. He gave anger a container. He told supporters that the goal was not to burn the system down, but to take it over legally and expose it in the process. This shift also changed how the state perceived him. Protest leaders are temporary. Party leaders are a permanent problem. A protest can be crushed. An organization requires dismantling. By choosing institutional engagement, Mondlane stopped being a moment and became a fixture. His message sharpened accordingly. He framed elections as the only legitimate source of authority, and openly warned that blocking participation would prove his entire argument. Every move against him would validate his claim that the system no longer tolerated genuine competition. That was the trap. If the government ignored him, his influence would grow. If it confronted him politically, it risked losing youth loyalty. If it crushed him, it would expose itself. Each option carried costs. For the first time in years, the ruling order was reacting instead of controlling. The youth noticed. Momentum consolidated. Support stopped being emotional and became strategic. People began asking not whether Mondlane was perfect, but whether he represented a breach in a closed system. For many, that was enough. Importantly, Mondlane avoided promising miracles. He talked about housing, voting age reform, and economic inclusion, but he framed them as commitments, not guarantees. That realism contrasted sharply with decades of grand pledges followed by quiet failure. The state now faced a dilemma it could not resolve with force alone. Protests had already proven costly. Exile had failed. Co-optation was impossible. Silence was dangerous. So the strategy shifted again, away from crowds and ballots toward files and charges. Which raised the next unavoidable question. What does a system do when political defeat becomes a real possibility? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Once Venancio Mondlane proved he could not be ignored, exiled, or outshouted, the confrontation shifted away from rallies and speeches and into courtrooms. The language changed overnight. He was no longer framed as an opposition politician. He was framed as a danger. Charges were prepared. Files were opened. Words like instigation and insurgency entered the conversation. This was not accidental, it was tactical. Criminal cases do something protests cannot. They don't need public support. They don't require persuasion. They work slowly, quietly, and indefinitely. A trial doesn't even have to begin to achieve its purpose. The threat alone can drain momentum, frighten supporters, and freeze political timelines. The charges against Mondlane carried serious consequences. If pursued to conviction, they would not just put him in prison, they would permanently block him from contesting future elections. This was not about punishing past actions. It was about controlling future outcomes. What made the move risky was its timing. Mondlane had just repositioned himself as an electoral actor. He had rejected violence publicly. He had insisted on legality. Charging him at that moment blurred the line between law enforcement and political exclusion. Mondlane denied all allegations. He did not disappear. He did not soften his message. He remained visible, now surrounded by security, moving carefully but speaking clearly. To his supporters, this visibility mattered more than legal arguments. It reinforced the belief that the system was proving his point for him. The public reaction shifted again. The story stopped being about whether Mondlane should lead the country. It became about whether the country would allow competition at all. Even those skeptical of his leadership began questioning the fairness of removing opponents through courts instead of ballots. International attention followed. Analysts noted a familiar pattern seen elsewhere in the region. When liberation-era parties face generational threats, they cannot out-campaign, they out-prosecute. Law becomes a tool of risk management rather than justice. But criminalization carries its own danger. It transforms political conflict into moral conflict. It forces citizens to choose not between policies, but between authority and fairness. That choice is far harder to control. Inside Mozambique, tension thickened. Supporters waited. Opponents watched. The state hesitated, aware that pushing too hard could reignite the unrest it had only just contained. By now, it was clear that this was no longer about one man's ambitions. It was about the durability of a political model that had governed for decades without real challenge. Mondlane had exposed a vulnerability that liberation parties rarely admit. Once belief collapses, fear must do more work. And fear is unreliable, which leads to the final unavoidable reckoning. What does this confrontation reveal about the future of liberation parties, not just in Mozambique, but across Africa? What unfolded in Mozambique is not an anomaly. It is a stress test. And the result was clear. Liberation parties once governed through a combination of history, control, and patience. History delivered legitimacy. Control managed dissent. Patience was demanded from citizens. That formula worked when the memory of colonial rule was fresh and alternatives felt dangerous. It breaks down when the majority of the population has no lived connection to that past. Parties like Frelimo still dominate institutions, but institutions are no longer the same as consent. Young Mozambicans did not wake up one day and reject liberation history. They simply stopped allowing it to explain unemployment, debt, rising prices, and closed political space. The past became irrelevant to the problem in front of them. This is why the state's responses escalated in stages. First denial, then force, then legal exclusion. Each step revealed a system struggling to adapt to a new political reality. Loyalty is no longer inherited. It must be earned repeatedly. When that earning stops, authority becomes brittle. Mondlane's rise matters less for what he promises and more for what he proved. He demonstrated that the most dangerous challenge to liberation parties is not ideology, foreign interference, or armed rebellion. It is generational disengagement followed by strategic participation. When young people stop believing and stop withdrawing, when they stay inside the system to challenge it, that is when power feels genuinely threatened. Across southern Africa, the same signals are flashing. Voters no longer respond to liberation credentials alone. Protest movements are younger, more urban, and more coordinated. Elections are treated with suspicion. Courts are increasingly politicized. And ruling parties are discovering that suppressing challengers buys time, not trust. The deeper issue is structural. Liberation parties were built to defeat colonial states, not to compete endlessly in open political markets. Once competition becomes unavoidable, their instinct is defense, not renewal. That instinct accelerates decline. Mozambique shows where this road leads. Not necessarily to immediate collapse, but to permanent instability. A state that governs without belief must govern with pressure. A party that fears competition must narrow the field. Each move makes the next crisis sharper. Mondlane may still be blocked. His party may be weakened. The system may survive another election cycle. But something irreversible has already happened. A generation has learned that power does not respond to silence and that obedience is optional. That lesson does not unlearn itself. And as liberation parties across Africa look ahead, they face one question that no security force, court filing, or historical speech can delay forever. What replaces liberation legitimacy when the generation that no longer speaks refuses to carry it forward? Let us know in the comment section what is going to happen now. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.